Hi there, this is Phil with PhilFX, and I got another tutorial. Today is going to be at least part one of a 2 or maybe 3-part series on lights and lighting. I think to cover the subject or give the subject what it needs, today's tutorial I'm strictly going to be talking about lights in Maya. I'm not going to be talking about linear workflows, and I'm not going to be talking about how to light scenes. Before you can do any of that, you really need to understand just the basic lights in Maya and how those lights work. So let's go ahead and get started. And what I've got here is I have a couple of scenes. I've got a scene here that with no lights. It's a little tough to see, but there's some balls on here, and I'm using that as an array so you can see some things. If I hide this scene and then go up to another scene, I've got a scene here with this knot that I like to use a lot for lighting, and I've got a back plane and a couple of spotlights. So I'll probably use both of these scenes a little bit so we can show some of the different lights, show all the different lights in Maya and show how they work. So let's go ahead and get started here. And I want to start with the sphere scene. So let's enable that. We can see what I have here. I just have a neutral floor and just a whole combination of array of spheres that I put together, and they're all exactly lined up. And what I'm doing is I'm illuminating here from the right hand side. And so let's start with the first light, and that's an ambient light. The way you add lights to a scene is you go up here to create, and you come down here to lights, and let me do a tear off on this menu, and you can see you can add an ambient light, directional, point, spot, an area, and a volume. I have V-Ray, and because I have V-Ray, I actually have some other lights. If you don't have V-Ray, you wouldn't have these. But these top lights here are the ones that I'm going to be talking about today. If we hit the box, so we call up the create a light, you can see some of the defaults. Pardon me. You can set the intensity, the ambient shade, color, casting shadows, and things like that if you want to add a light. To be honest, when it comes to lights and even cameras, I typically don't call up the option box. I just usually go ahead and just click on here and add a light, and then I go over to the attribute editor and I change that. So that's what I am going to be doing through this class. So let's take the ambient light that I've already created and let's enable that, turn that on. And if we go over to the attribute editor here, we can see the attributes of an ambient light. And this is its default state. It comes up with a white color, an intensity of 1, an ambient shade of 0.45, and you can do shadows with an ambient light. You can do ray trace shadows. You can't do depth map shadows, but you can do ray trace shadows. Let's get the render up here, and we'll do a quick render of this scene so we can see what that looks like. And you can see the lighting that the ambient light gives. Now I tend to not use ambient lights too much when I do lighting. It gives kind of a very false looking light, and it sometimes works in interior lighting, and you can use it to put a very low intensity light on your scene so you can give maybe some illumination into some of the dark corners. But other than that, I really don't care to use ambient lights too much. You can see right now that there is a directionality to the illumination that's being given here. In other words, there's shadows on the spheres in front, and these other spheres over here are being illuminated. That has to do with this term here called ambient shade. And the ambient shade, if we crank that down to 0, and let's save this, do a render again, and when ambient shade is 0, it's the ambient light is 100% illuminating in all directions, and there's no directionality to it. And so this will give you lighting everywhere, but you can see from this render it's again, it's not that great of a light. If I go in here and I take this value to 1 and we come back, let's go ahead and save that, render it again, and now there's an extreme directionality to it, and you can see again that there's these lights at these spheres at the top corner are being illuminated while these here are being shaded. Now that does have to do with the perspective, the point of view of what's being rendered. If I turn this around and we go over to the other side, and let's save that, hit a render again. Now you see that the top part here is being illuminated, and the spheres here, where on this previous render these guys were illuminated from that perspective, and now these spheres are dark and these guys over here are being illuminated. So you can control that, the desired amount. The default when this comes up is, like I said, it was at 0.45, and that controls essentially the ambient shading. So that's the ambient light. Let's hide that, and let's call up a directional light. And let me put this back over here so we can see that. Now, directional lights are really what you want to use in your scenes if you're trying to emulate sunlight and the sun outside. A couple of things that you can see with a directional light: you have this ability such that the type of light that is emitted, you can control if it's going to emit diffuse light or specular light. You do have the ability so you can create depth map shadows, and you can create ray trace shadows with the directional light. The one thing about a directional light, it is 100% directional. In other words, where this light is placed in the scene, the only thing that matters is the angle, essentially. Where I physically place it in X and Y, the illumination is the same. And let me demonstrate that real quick. So we have this scene right here, and I did set this up on purpose. It's going to be a little bit interesting output on this first render. So we render this out, and all you see illuminated is this front row of spheres. Even though essentially my preview window is showing everything illuminated, right now this is set up so all of these spheres here are blocking everything else behind it. So the only thing that you see are these front spheres being illuminated. And in fact, if I take this directional light and I just move it straight up, I don't want to change it in X, I just want to change it in Y. So let's change that 8 in Y and go up, and we render that again. Same kind of thing. It's only illuminating that front face, and even though I moved it up, what's happening is these lines are all, the light lines are all parallel to my plane. So if we want to really make this illuminate my scene, I need to put some angle in here. Now let's go in and we'll re-render this, and we're seeing some illumination across the whole thing, across the whole scene. And so we're getting some shadows, some nice shadows, and you're seeing some illumination everywhere. And what I mean by when I say that where you place the directional light is not important, the only thing that matters is the angle, I went ahead and I just saved that. Let's go in and take our directional light, and let's take and translate this. I'll move it here, and move it here, move it here, move it here. So I've moved this all over the place, and it's definitely not where I had placed it originally. And let's go back and let's re-render the scene. And if you look at my previous render versus this render, they're identical, which speaks to what I was saying. It doesn't matter where you place a directional light. The only thing that's important is the angle in which it's being shown. And so you can go in and you can essentially move it in translations anywhere in your scene. I typically like to put a directional light somewhere in my field of view of my camera where my animation is, so I can control that. But the only thing that really matters on a directional light is its rotation and where the angle where that's pointing. Let me go back and I'm going to zero all these out so we put it back to where it was to begin with. And one thing about a directional light, or actually I'll bring this up. We're going to go switch to the point light next. So let me hide this. Excuse me. Bring this out. So now we have a point light. All right. And when we look at a point light, like the directional light, we can do depth map shadows and we can do ray trace shadows. So we have the ability to do those kind of shadows. We have the ability to emit diffuse or emit specular. It defaults to having both of those. But now there's a new parameter that came up. It's called decay rate. On the directional light, if I just click on this, even though it's hid, you can see here, there's nothing here that says decay rate. That's because the directional light, the intensity of the light is always constant. Regardless of the distance in your scene, the intensity is constant 100%. It's what's basically considered to be no decay. A point light, you actually have control over the decay rate. And within Maya, there's 4 different decay rates. There's no decay, there's a linear decay, there's what's called quadratic decay, and cubic decay. I've made a little graph here to show this. And if you look at decay, this is if I have intensity and I've just normalized this so the intensity values go between 0 and 1. If you have an intensity of 10,000, if you multiplied each one of these values times 10,000, the graph looks the same. So this is normalized to 1, and I've just got some arbitrary distances here that go from 1 to 10. And direct light and real sunlight follow this curve. In other words, this is no decay. This green line here is my no decay line, and this says that the intensity does not fall off. Now for the purists out there, I've got this little asterisk. Yes, technically, yes, sunlight does fall off as 1 over the distance squared from the sun. But the thing is that the intensity of sunlight is so bright compared to physical distances that we deal with in a room or even outside. For all intents and purposes, there is no decay of sunlight for any measurable distances, and especially anything that we would do in modeling in 3D. You have to get to distances of the difference between the Earth to the Sun and Mars to the Sun before you really start seeing variations in intensity of sunlight. And if you happen to be modeling something like that, well, maybe you need to worry about it. But for 99% of what anybody's going to be doing in terms of modeling with 3D, for all intents and purposes, sunlight and the direct light, which is used to model that, there is no fall off. These other lines here, the red line is a linear decay. The yellow line is what's called a quadratic decay. This is fall off of intensity of 1 over the distance squared. So if you can see, if I have an intensity of 1 at a distance of 1, when I go to a distance of 2, my intensity here is at 0.25. So my intensity is 1/4 of what it is, and all I did was double my distance, go from 1 to 2. If I go from 2 to 4, I go from 0.25 to a little over 0.6, or is it 0.06 here, which is, again, this value here is 1/4 the value of intensity right here. And this relationship holds true all the way down. All right, so essentially every time you double the distance, the intensity is going to fall by a factor of 4. That's what a 1 over r squared relationship follows. This last curve, this blue curve, is what's called a cubic curve. We have that available to us in Maya, and it falls off even faster. This is somewhat unnatural, but it can be very handy to use this kind of relationship if you're trying to do something with an effect or something where you want some light to be very bright at one point in your scene, but you want it to fall off very fast so it's not affecting anything else in your scene. So we go back here, and again we have this point light. If we go in and let's go ahead and do a render with this. And you see the point light looks very much like the ambient light. Okay, we have some directionality. It actually is omnidirectional. It's actually radiating the same in all directions. The thing of it is where I have it placed low on the floor, the light is being blocked by these other spheres. If I went ahead and took this and I pull this up, and let's do another render. You can see I'm getting a little bit better of illumination across everything in my scene. A point light, as you might guess, where you would use that, everybody's got point lights in their house. They're light bulbs. Okay, so you've got a spherical kind of small light that is illuminating equally in all directions. Is what a point light is used for. I use it also sometimes in scenes if there's something under a table or something in a back corner and you want to get a little bit of light in there and you're trying to maybe fake it out just a little bit. Point lights can be pretty handy for things like that. The main point with those is they're omnidirectional. You can control the decay and they will cast shadows. So let me hide that one. Let's go on to the spotlight. Now the spotlight and the area light and the directional light. These three lights, directional, spot, and area, if I had to rank order them, these are the three most common lights that I use in any one scene. I may not use a point light. I probably don't use an ambient light, and I rarely use a volume light, but I use area lights, spotlights, and directional lights in almost everything that I do. In terms of setting up scenes. I would suspect that in your case, once you get familiar with how these work, that's probably will be the case for yourself. So let's unhide this and have our spotlight here. And we can see this. Let's do a quick render. You can see it fanning out at the moment because again, where I have it positioned, I have a lot of things that are blocked. Let's go over some of the parameters real quick and then we can demonstrate those on our scene. So if we have a spotlight, like the point light, we can control the emit diffuse, emit specular. We have control over the decay. We have this thing called cone angle, and it comes up with the default of 40, and if I open this up, you can see how that is spreading. And it's illuminating more of my scene. I can actually take this, I can take it all the way out to just about 180. I can't quite get to 180, but you can get almost out to there. And so it's basically saying how wide is my cone in terms of the spot that it's illuminating. We can create shadows, both depth map and ray trace shadows with a spotlight. We have two other things here. In addition to the cone angle, we have this thing called penumbra and drop-off. The penumbra has to do with the very edge of the light here. If we look at this and we can see where this light is coming, and we'll do a couple of renders real quick to enhance this, but you can see this has a pretty sharp edge the way that this is defined, and this penumbra has to do with how sharp is that edge. One thing I want to show you with the spotlight, and essentially all of your lights you can do this. When you select a light, if you hit the T key, it's going to make a liar out of me. Okay, so we select the spotlight and we hit T. All right, I have if you're familiar in After Effects, there's a thing called a point of interest. That's essentially what this is. So this is a pointer for my spotlight, so I can put this in my scene, and now if I take my spotlight up and we look at this, my spotlight will always point at that pointer, and so I can move my spotlight around, and if I move it in the world, you can see it's always pointing at that spot. So that gives me, that's very, very handy, especially with spotlights. I use it all the time with spotlights, where I usually with a spotlight I'm wanting to point it at something. So I'll call up the spotlight, I'll hit that T key, and that'll allow me to pick where I want to point that. If I decide that I don't want to use that pointer anymore, there's this little blue loop here. If I click on that once and click on it again, there you see the little point of interest pointer goes away. I can, click on that again, hit the W key, and now I can move this. And I can move it, and it's set to component. I can go and I can move that in world coordinates. So we can go back. So now if I wanted to, I can move this light, and now it's not tied to that point of interest. All right. And so that's takes me back so I can get rid of that point of interest, and I can now move it around in my scene. Another thing that you can do with all of the lights essentially in a scene is Maya has the ability where I can look through a light just like as if the light was a camera. So I have this light selected. If you go up to panels, you come down here, there's look through selected. So if I click on that, I'm looking through that spotlight. So this is the view of my scene as if I'm looking through the spotlight. So I can go in and I can pan around, right? And so this is the view that my spotlight is in particular is seeing. So I can change in my scene where my spotlight is pointing simply by essentially looking through the spotlight. Now to get back, I go to perspective and I go here, and we can see where I'm at. That's very handy. And again, I went into that by going up to panels. You select the light and you look through selected. You get back to it, you go to panels, and then you go back to the camera you want. So let's do a quick render here so I can show you what this penumbra and drop off do. So here you can see this sharp edge, and I think the best way to show this is to use the IPR feature, the Inplace Render feature of Maya. And the way we activate that is we go over here and I clip on this clapboard called IPR, and I select a window, and it's going to go ahead and render this out. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to vary this penumbra, and look what that's doing. Okay, as I'm going positive, you can see the penumbra, it started at this edge right here, and now I'm getting a softening as this is going out as my penumbra is going positive. If I go negative, okay, it actually started from the same point, which is where the penumbra 0 is, and then it gives me a soft edge as it comes in. All right, so that's pulling that in further. And if I take this drop off, I can crank the degree with which it's dropping off. So you can see I can drop it off pretty radical. A small change in drop off makes a pretty dramatic change in how that falls off. So you can see just with these two, varying these two parameters of drop off and the penumbra angle, you can vary what kind of light that you're getting. Note too that in varying the penumbra angle and drop off, it's not changing my shadows. Okay, my shadows are controlled here with ray trace, and if I want to change right now, you can see my shadows are very, very crisp. If I want to increase the softness of those shadows, then I would go in here and you start to increase what's called the light radius. And if I jack this up, we should start seeing those. I think for the scale I probably have to bring that up quite a bit. Okay, there they are. Now you're starting to see some softer shadows by increasing the radius. Notice you're getting noise though, and so to decrease that noise, what I need to do is I need to increase my shadow rays. So if I increase the number of rays I have shooting out, I can now decrease the amount of that noise. Alright, so the softness of the shadows is controlled right here under the ray trace shadows, but the softness and hardness of the light edge for a spotlight is controlled up here with the penumbra the drop off, and to some degree the cone angle, where you set that cone angle. To stop my in-place rendering, let's go ahead and we'll hit the stop light up here. That turns that off, and let's just go ahead and do a quick render of the whole scene. And there you can see we've got a pretty nice render, and we've got a nice spotlight in terms of how that's lighting my scene. Okay, let's move on. We'll hide that. Let's call up an area light. Area lights are real important. I use them a whole lot. I do a lot of product rendering for clients, and area lights make very nice studio lights. I think if you're familiar with a photographer's studio, an area light is probably the closest thing you have to essentially what's called a softbox. And so using area lights, you can emulate the kind of lighting that you get with softboxes. So right now, here's my area light. I've got a relatively small one. If we did a quick render here, it's not going to, whoops, light much of my scene because I have it quite small and the intensity is quite down. So you can see it's lighting, but not a whole lot. It's a little bit off center, so we're getting a little bit of illumination. Let's go ahead and take this and light my spotlight. I'm going to hit T so I get essentially a pointer for this, and I'm going to bring this up. And what I want to do with this area light first is let's take the intensity and we'll bring this intensity up. And let's go ahead and we'll do a render on that. You can see area lights hit pretty hard. All right, it doesn't take much in intensity to get quite a bright light out of there. I can probably crank this back down. Let's do a re-render. There we go. So that's giving me a nice diffuse light. Let's go ahead and save this, because what I want to do, one of the things I do with area lights is area lights will respond to scaling. All the other lights, if you hit the scale key, it doesn't do anything to them. An area light, it does. So if I go in and I pick this area light and I hit R, and now I scale this in X and I scale this in Y and make this light so it physically looks bigger. I haven't moved it. I haven't touched the intensity. All I did was physically make it look bigger. So I cached this render. Let's go ahead and render this again. All right, a couple things to note. The intensity is definitely different. Well, I moved my point of view. Let's go ahead and do this here. Let me take this. We'll cache this one. That's tougher to see. And let me scale this back down, and let me scale this back down this way. So all I'm doing is changing the size. Let's render this again. Okay, this is what I wanted you to see. Notice this is the larger one, this is the smaller one. The smaller one has a brighter intensity, a brighter apparent intensity than the larger one. What's going on here is because I did not change my intensity value, the only thing I did is scale the light. But when I scaled that light, I have the same amount of illuminated power, but it's coming out of a larger area. That means the power per unit area goes down. So my intensity per area of the surface of my area light on a large light is lower, unless I take this intensity and crank it up. Another thing you will note is this is grainier than this one. Notice this is a lot clearer, and this one has got some grain to it. When you take an area light and you scale it up, you start to get noise issues, and there's a way to fix that. Right here under the mental ray tab with area lights, you go down, you click on that, and there's use light shape, and it defaults with 8 samples. Well, I can take this number of samples and crank this up to, say, something like 32, and take note of this time. This took 9 seconds to render. So we click this again. All this is rendering the area light. Like the spotlight, you can control diffuse, you can control specular. Okay, here we go. So the finished in 19 seconds. So when I had my samples set at 8, I finished in 9 seconds. When my samples were at 32, it took 19 seconds. But you can see that the noise has been significantly reduced. So by increasing my samples, I reduced my noise, and now I've got a little bit more even light here. So you can get rid of the noise effect. What I end up doing a lot with area lights in a scene is I'll scale them a little bit, but what I'll tend to do is, rather than take one light and scale it very large, I'll instantiate numerous smaller area lights and keep my high sample rate to some reasonable number, like somewhere between 16 and 32. If I got to go much higher than 64, there's something wrong. Your render times will really increase significantly if you increase this as you increase the sample rate. So I found it's far better to use more smaller lights with a lower sample rate than one large light with a ridiculous sample rate. Like I said, like the spotlight, you can use that T command, so you can get a point of interest, so you can move it around and you can point it. We can control the decay, we can emit diffuse, we can emit specular, we can control the color. So the last light I'd like to look at here is a thing called the volume light. And let's bring that up. And a volume light is, like the name says, it illuminates a volume. This particular preview that we're seeing is actually quite a bit of a misnomer. When we render this out, this is not going to look like that. Let's do a quick render, and this looks black. And the reason it looks black is the volume light illuminates what's inside the volume. So right now I don't have anything essentially inside that volume. So if I increase the size of this sphere, so it's much larger and it encompasses some of those spheres, we can render this again. Okay, it's starting to illuminate some things. So you can see some of these spheres starting to be illuminated. I really need to take this and crank the intensity up a fair amount. And now you can see that we're starting to get some illumination, and what's happening is the illumination is coming from the very center of that sphere and going out. Look at how these things are being illuminated. Okay, it's being illuminated spherical. It's like there was a dot. What it allows you to do, it's like having a point light, and the light only goes as far as the extent of the sphere, and it doesn't go any further. So I have a point light in the center. It's illuminating these spheres, but it's being cut off by the physical size of the sphere that I've defined. And at the moment, the light shape is a sphere. I can change that. I can change this to a box. So here's a sphere. And with this kind of location of items, there's not a whole lot of difference between a sphere and a box. Depending upon how you have things, but you can change this from a box to a sphere to a cylinder or a cone. So you have a cylinder, you have a cone. What this essentially allows you to do is to put some very focused light source in a small area, and you can control the volume with which that area is going to be illuminated. That really is the whole key there behind a volume light. So let's go back. Whoa, that's not what I wanted to do. I've got a quick cheat sheet. I'll post this PDF on my website. And it's really just a 2-pager, but this is kind of a lighting cheat sheet. You go through the types that you have in Maya. We've got an ambient, directional, point, spot, an area, and a volume. And I got a column here, can you control the diffuse and specular? On an ambient, no you can't, but on all the other lights, yes you can. Can it be omnidirectional? An ambient light, I say yes and no, because you can control the directionality of an ambient by setting that ambient shade, with 0 being 100% omnidirectional and 1 being very directional. A directional light is not, by definition, omnidirectional. A point light, by definition, is. A spotlight cannot be omnidirectional. Your area and volume lights can be. All right. An area light, you may not think it can be omnidirectional, but in fact, you can control the directionality with the light shade. I forgot to show that. Let's call that up real quick here. If we look at an area light and we go to use light shape, we can make it a disc, sphere, cylinder, or custom. And because we can make it a sphere, then all of a sudden this can be omnidirectional. So in effect, you could make an omnidirectional area light by making the shape a sphere. And in so doing, you can get some omnidirectionality to it. Directionality, yes or no, same kind of thing. Shadows, ambient light will do ray trace only, where everything else does ray trace and a depth map. Can you control the decay? Ambient and directional, no you can't. Volume, you can't. Well, yes you can essentially somewhat control the decay, because in a volume light you set the boundary of the volume. By setting the boundary of the volume, you essentially do stop it. So there is no light that exceeds outside that volume. So this is maybe no with an asterisk. So anyway, I think that covers the basics of lights. I think the thing to do when you're getting started with lighting is to just go ahead and create some scenes and play with the lights like I have here. If I do this, and let me hide this and open up this scene, and you've got a scene here where I've got this knot. I've got a couple of spotlights, and if we take and render this out, I have it being illuminated from a couple of different sources with some spots. And this actually is the setup that I use when I'm trying to evaluate materials. And so I find I like this knot because I get some shadows, I've got edges, I've got things that are directly facing me, and I've got some faces that are on angles. And so all in all, it makes kind of a nice setup for me to work with when I'm trying to set some things up. I can go ahead actually and I can put this Maya file and I'll just zip it up with the PDF. So if you want to download and work with this file, you can do that. So this has been Phil with Phil Effects, and we'll have part 2, and on part 2 we'll cover lighting, essentially lighting techniques, and I think part 3 what we'll do is we'll do a part 3 where we'll go over linear workflows. Thanks again. Catch you later.